I, I've told this maybe 4 times in 15 years, and every single time I get to the part where I have to explain the geography, and I watch whoever I'm talking to start doing arithmetic in their head, I, and then they say something about being tired, and I let them. So I'm going to do the geography first this time and get it out of the way, because if you don't have the map, you don't have anything. Beth lived out on Route 20 south of Buckhannon, and I lived on the north side of town, off 33 toward the western side. 20 minutes, door to door. I had made that drive, and I've actually tried to count this. Somewhere between 600 and 800 times over 3 years. That's not an exaggeration. That's 4 or 5 nights a week for the better part of a decade of my 20s. I knew that road the way you know a stairway in your own house. And here's what's on it. Because I need you to hold these in order the way I held them. You come off a road and you're on 20 north and it's dark. No lights, farm ground, then timber. About 4 minutes in, you cross the Buckhannon River on a 2-lane bridge with those low concrete rails that everybody in that county has scraped at some point. Then a curve. Then a long straight past a church with a sign that in those days had a plastic letterboard that was always missing an E. Then the 4-way at Tallmansville Road. Then you come into town and there's a stoplight, and a Dairy Queen. And then you're on 33 heading west with the ridge on your right. And past that there's the interchange for the 4-lane and a green sign with an arrow. And my turn is 1.5 miles past that. Every one of those things is a beat. You don't think about them. Your body counts them and tells you where you are, and you never notice it doing it until it stops. This was November of 2009. A Tuesday, I want to say, or a Wednesday, a weeknight, because we both worked. Beth was riding with me to my place to pick up a coat she'd left, and then I was going to run her back. That's it. That's the whole errand. 20 minutes there, 20 minutes back, and we were arguing about something stupid, the way you do at 24 with your closest friend. And I remember it was about whether her sister was a snob. It had rained earlier and stopped. Not fog exactly, but that low ground haze you get in the bottoms in November when the air is colder than the ground. The wipers went on and off intermittently. We crossed the river. I remember it because Beth said something about the water being up, and I looked left as we came off the bridge the way I always did, and the guardrail was where the guardrail is. We passed the church. Missing E. We hit the 4-way at Tallmansville, and there was nobody at it, and I rolled it, which I always did. And here's the thing I want to be precise about, because it's the whole story. I was not on autopilot. I know what autopilot feels like. Everybody does. Everybody has arrived home with no memory of the last 5 miles. That was not this. I was talking, I was engaged. I was making a case about Beth's sister. I was present, and I was checking off landmarks in that background way, and every single one of them was correct, and in order and at the right interval. About 15 minutes in, I said, out loud, there's the 4-lane. I said it in the middle of a sentence about something else, because that sign is my cue that I'm 3 minutes out. Beth said something back. She heard me say it, that's important, and I'll come back to it. Because Beth is the reason I can't file this under a thing that happened inside my own head. And then I turned to say something to her, and I saw her face. She was looking out the windshield with an expression I had never seen on her, and she said, "Where are we?" And I looked, there was nothing I recognized. Not one thing. And I want to make that specific, because I didn't recognize it as a soft sentence, and this was not soft. We were on a 4-lane, divided with a median going up a long grade with rock cut on the right side, an actual cut face, blasted rock, 30 feet of it, and there is no rock cut like that anywhere on my route. There is no 4-lane on my route. My route is 2-lane the whole way except for a mile of town, and the guardrail was different. The signs were the wrong shape. The mile markers on the shoulder were there at all, which they aren't on 20. I remember my hands going cold on the wheel. Neither of us said anything for a while. Beth had her hand flat on the dash. And I did the only thing there was to do, which is I kept driving. because you're doing 65 on a 4-lane in the dark, and there's no shoulder to speak of on a grade. The next sign was a green one, and it said Weston, I, and it said a number, and I don't remember the number. We came over that grade, and there was an exit, and I took it, and we came down into a lit area, a gas station, a Sheetz or something like it, and I pulled in, and I put it in park, and we sat there. We were on I-79, somewhere south of Weston, headed south. I want to lay out what that means. My house is north and west of Buckhannon. The interstate is west of all of it. To be where we were, I would have had to go through the town of Buckhannon, get on the 4-lane, drive west to the interstate interchange, get on I-79, and then go south for a good while. And I have thought about the mileage for 15 years, and the number I keep landing on is somewhere between 45 and 55 miles off the route. In a direction that is not just wrong, but is close to opposite of where I meant to be. At an average of 60, that's the better part of an hour on top of the 15 minutes I thought I'd been driving. The clock said we'd been in that car for 1 hour and 11 minutes. Beth cried a little, not hysterically. She sat there and her chin went, and she wiped her face and said, I don't understand, about 4 times. And here's what I need you to understand about her, because this is where people always want to make it my fault, and it can't be. Beth was not asleep. Beth was talking to me the entire time. She has an independent memory of the bridge and of the church sign and of me saying, there's the 4-lane. She noticed the same wrongness at the same moment I did. 2 people, awake in conversation. Both counting the same landmarks for over an hour, and neither of us registered a single thing that wasn't on that 20-minute route. We did not stop for gas. That was the second thing. My tank was where it should have been for a 20-minute drive, and I looked at that gauge in that parking lot and did the arithmetic, and it did not work either, and I have never been able to make it work. And the only honest thing I can say is that I do not trust my memory of a fuel gauge from 2009. We drove home. Took us an hour and change coming back, up the interstate and east on the 4-lane and through town. And neither of us said much. We passed all of it in reverse, the interchange, the ridge, the Dairy Queen, and it was all completely normal and completely there, and that made it worse somehow. Now here's the part I've spent 15 years on. The rational explanation is highway hypnosis, and I've read about it and I've talked to a neurologist at a party about it in 2015. It's real. Automaticity. Your motor systems will drive a car competently for extended periods while your conscious attention is elsewhere, and your memory for that period is essentially not written. That's not woo. That's documented, and it explains most cases of people ending up somewhere they didn't intend. But every account of it I've ever read has the same shape. The person has no memory of the interval. It's a gap, a blank. I don't have a blank. I have a filled interval. I have specific, sequential, correct memories of landmarks I could not possibly have passed, in the correct order at the correct intervals. In a conversation I can partially reconstruct. My mind didn't skip. It produced, and so did Beth's, independently. And that's the thing that has never let me go. Because the tidy version requires 2 people to have generated the same false itinerary in parallel while talking to each other, and I don't know what to do with that. We tried to talk about it exactly once more, about 6 weeks later, and it went badly. Beth got upset, and then she got angry, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, I don't want to know what we were doing for that hour. That was in January. She moved to Charlotte in the spring. We're still friendly. Christmas cards, the occasional message, and we have never once mentioned it again in 15 years. Not a word. I've been to her wedding. I've held her daughter. And there's one more piece and then I'm finished. In 2019, I went to a funeral for a great uncle at a church up Sand Run, and I got talking to an old fellow on the steps afterward. A man of about 80 who'd driven a milk route in that county in the 60s. And somehow, I don't know how funerals do this, I ended up telling him a short version, not the whole thing. Just that I'd gotten badly turned around one night on 20, And he did not laugh, and he did not look surprised, and he said, "Whereabouts?" I said, "Between the river and Tallmansville." And he nodded, "Aye." And he looked out at the parking lot for a while, and he said his father had told him not to run that stretch in the fall when the fog was in the bottoms, and that it wasn't about the driving. And I said, "What was it about?" And he said he wouldn't say. And that's all I got. He talked about milk trucks for another 10 minutes, and then his daughter came to get him. I don't offer that as evidence. An old man's father's rule from 80 years ago is not evidence of anything, and I know that. But here's what I turn over at 2 in the morning, and it isn't the 50 miles. It's that I have made that drive maybe 200 times since, and I still count the landmarks, the river, the church, the four-way, every single time, without meaning to. And I've never once been able to stop myself from wondering whether I'm counting them because they're there, or whether I've been counting them my whole life the way I counted them that night. And the only reason I know where I am is that so far, every time, somebody's let me arrive. The house is on Miller Ridge in Ritchie County, West Virginia, and my great-grandfather put the first 2 rooms of it up in 1911. And I want to say plainly that my family has been in it for 4 generations without a single day of it belonging to anybody else. That's the thing you need before anything else. It was never bought. It was never sold. It passed. My grandfather was Carl Ray Metz. He was born on the 21st of March, 1922, in the front room of that house, and I was born on the 21st of March, 1975, in a hospital in Parkersburg. And for the 11 years we overlapped in that house, he made a great deal out of that. Same birthday. He called me his half, which I didn't understand until I was grown, and then understood completely. His other half, the second one, the one that came back around, he raised me more than my mother did, and I don't say that to be unkind to her. She was 20 when she had me, and she worked at a glass plant in Ellenboro on rotating shifts for 19 years. And what that means practically is that I ate breakfast with my grandfather every morning of my childhood, and I sat with him on that porch every evening. He died in 1993 when I was 18 in the back bedroom, which is where everybody in that family has died. My mother died in August of 1999. Cancer, and it went fast. 4 months from the diagnosis, and she was 51. I was 24 with a 2-year-old, and the house came to me. So that's the arrangement. That's who was in that house and who wasn't. Now the geography, because it matters and it always matters. Miller Ridge is a gravel road that runs the top of a ridge for 6 miles between 2 county routes. And there are 11 houses on it, and about half of them are empty now. The house sits back off the road with a yard that drops away on the north side into a hollow that runs down to Bone Creek. Timber on 3 sides. My nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile toward the far end, and she was 78. In 2001, there was no cell service on that ridge, and there is barely any now. I want to be honest about the house's character, because people always want the house to be creepy, and it wasn't. It was a good house. 2 stories, white siding over the original chestnut boards, tin roof, big kitchen. It was warm. It smelled like wood smoke and my grandmother's percolator 40 years after she quit using it. I was never once afraid in that house at any point in my life. Not as a child, not alone with a toddler, not ever. And there was never anything unexplained in it. Not a knock, not a shadow, not a cold spot. Not in 26 years. I need that on the record because otherwise you'll think this was a haunted house, and it was not. It was a house where one thing happened once. Michael came back around in March of 2001. He was my son's father. He'd left in 1998 when Dylan was 6 months old. Not dramatically, just gone. An apartment in Columbus and a phone number that stopped working. And then he called me out of nowhere 3 years later and said he'd gotten himself straightened out and wanted to know his son. And I let him. I want to be very clear that I let him, and that at the time it seemed like the right and generous thing, and that everybody I knew told me it was. He was in the house 4 months. He was good with Dylan, and I'll never take that away from him. And he was bad with me in a way that I did not have a vocabulary for at 26, and that I would recognize in about 4 seconds now. It was not physical. It was the other thing, the slow reorganization of a person, where you find yourself explaining why you called your aunt back and apologizing for the tone of it, and then a month later you notice you don't call your aunt. He did not like the house. That's a strange thing to put in, but it's true, and it started early. He thought it was too far out. He thought it was too old, and that it needed too much. And that I ought to sell it, and we ought to get something in town. And there was always a reason, and every reason was reasonable. And by June, there was a real estate agent's card on my refrigerator that I had not put there. The night was the 11th of July. I know the date because it was 4 days before Dylan's 4th birthday, and I've got the party pictures. The argument started over a checking account, and it was not really about a checking account. It went about 40 minutes, and it got to the place those things get, where it's not about anything anymore. And he said something about my mother. I'm not going to repeat it. It was about her dying, and it was about what she'd left me, and it was designed, the way those sentences are designed, to be the worst available thing. And then he went out the front door and got in his truck and left. Not for good. He came back around midnight. But he left. And Dylan was asleep upstairs, and I sat down on the living room floor with my back against the couch, and I came apart. I'd like to describe that properly. It wasn't crying the way you cry at a funeral. It was the other kind, the kind that comes out of your chest instead of your face, where you can't get a breath under it. And what I was doing in my head, and I remember this exactly, is I was thinking, I have nobody. My grandfather was dead. My grandmother was dead. My mother had been dead 23 months. There was not one person left alive who had known me my whole life. I was sitting on the floor of a house that had held all of them, and I was completely by myself in it. The television was against the north wall. On top of it, one of those big consoles from about 1993, sat the VCR. And on top of the VCR was a stack of tapes, 7 or 8 of them, squared up edges even, because that's how I keep things. The top one was The Land Before Time, because Dylan watched it every day of his life that year. That stack had been on that VCR for months. It didn't move when the front door slammed. It didn't move when a truck went by on the gravel, and it went off, not slid, not toppled. The whole stack came off that VCR sideways. Together, and hit the floor about 3 feet out from the base of the television, 3 feet hit. That's the thing. I have set a stack of tapes on a VCR and pushed it off with my hand about 100 times since, in the years after, in the way you do when you're trying to make a thing happen again so it can be nothing. If you nudge them, they fall at the base. If you slap them, they go out. That stack went out, and it went as one thing, and it landed spread in a fan the way a stack does when something has taken it across the top and swept. The sound was the loudest thing I have ever heard in that house, and I stopped crying, instantly. I want to be honest about my reaction because everybody expects screaming and there wasn't any. I stopped breathing hard and I sat completely still on that floor with my hands in my lap, and I looked at those tapes on the carpet. And what I felt, and I have had 24 years to find a better word and I haven't, was that somebody had come in the room. Not a presence, not a chill. Just that flat animal certainty you have when you're alone in a house and then you're not. The thing your body knows before your mind does. And I said out loud, "Pap?" Nothing. Of course nothing. Nothing else happened that night or any other night. I sat there another minute and then I got up and I picked up those tapes and I stacked them back on the VCR. And I went upstairs and I got in bed with my son. Now here's the fair part, because I owe it. That house had a floor with some spring in it. Pine on hand-hewn joists, and there's a place in the middle of that living room where you could feel a bounce if somebody crossed it hard. And an old console television is not level, and a VCR sits on top of it on rubber feet, and things do walk. Vibration walks things. That's not mysterious, it's how a washing machine crosses a basement. But I had been sitting still on the floor for 10 minutes. Nobody crossed that room. There was no truck on the gravel and no train. There's no track within 11 miles, and it was July, so the furnace wasn't running. I have gone at this from every angle a person can go, at a thing in 24 years, and the physics I keep landing on is that something has to hit a stack to move it 3 feet, and nothing hit it. Here's what I did about it. And it's the only part of this that I'm proud of. I didn't tell Michael. I never told him, not that night when he came back at midnight, not ever. But I got up the next morning and I took that real estate card off my refrigerator and I threw it in the wood stove. And a week and a half later, after the birthday party, I told him he had to go. It was the hardest thing I ever did and I was terrified doing it, and he did not go easily. And it took a month and a half and a conversation with a magistrate in Harrisville. But he went in September, and he has seen Dylan maybe 15 times in 24 years, and I have never once regretted it. And I want to be careful here, because I know what a story like this wants to say. It wants to say my grandfather knocked those tapes off that VCR to give me the strength to put a man out of my house. I don't believe that. I've tried and I can't get there. That's too neat, and I'm 50 years old, and I've buried too many people to believe in tidy things. What I believe, and this is as far as I'll go, is that I was sitting on the floor of a house that 4 generations of my people had lived and died in at the exact bottom of my life, thinking the words I have nobody. And something in that room made the loudest noise it could make. That's all. It didn't say anything. It didn't appear. It didn't fix one single thing about my situation. It knocked a stack of children's videotapes onto a floor, and then it never did anything again for 24 more years. And the part I turn over at 2 in the morning is this. I still live in that house. Dylan's 27 and he lives in Morgantown, and I'm here by myself now. And I'm the last one, and there's nobody after me who wants it, so it will get sold. Sometime in the next 15 or 20 years, some family will buy a 114-year-old house on a ridge in Ritchie County for very little money, and they'll be the first people in it who don't belong to it. And I have never been able to decide whether what happened in my living room on the 11th of July, 2001, was somebody looking after me, or whether it was the house itself doing the only thing it has ever done. On the one night somebody sat on its floor and talked about leaving. You are an expert cinematic image prompt generator. Your task is to create ultra-realistic, location-driven horror image prompts based on the story pasted below. Each prompt should focus on the environment, horror setting, lighting, weather, and eerie atmosphere. Do not focus on faces, portraits, or close-ups of characters. All prompts must be wide-angle, environment-based visuals inspired by Appalachian horror. Use these locked visual rules. Ultra-realistic cinematic photo Appalachian horror theme night. Rain, fog, candlelight, forest shadow-sold cabins, ranger stations, winding roads, abandoned kitchens, no stylized art, no anime. I know AI art look focus on emotional scenery, not people. Stockless or output rules. No headings or labels, just clean. Direct prompts. 1 prompt per scene. Every image should feel like a screenshot from a horror film in the Appalachian wilderness. Paste your inputs below. Story: I'm 81 now, and there are maybe 4 things left in my head from 1974 that are still sharp, and this is one of them, and I've never understood why it stayed when so much better material went. 7 of us went over that autumn on a teaching exchange, a program the college ran with an authority up in the West Riding. And what it meant practically is that 7 West Virginia girls between 20 and 22 got put down in villages in the Yorkshire Dales in September and told to teach primary school until Christmas. I was in a place called Arncliffe. If you don't know that country, it is the closest thing to home I have ever found on the other side of an ocean. Limestone instead of sandstone, and no trees to speak of, but the same shape. Valleys running down between high ground, a road along the bottom, farms up the sides that you cannot understand how anybody works. And that same thing where the light goes early because the hill is in the way, and the same feeling that if your car quit, you would be walking a long time before you found a lit window. I want to say that at the front because I think it's why I took to those people, and why they took to me. Half of what I heard in that village I'd heard from my grandmother in Nicholas County in a different accent. The same fatalism, the same jokes at funerals. The same absolute unwillingness to say certain things out loud after dark. We traveled on the weekends because we were 21 and had train passes. Edinburgh, York, the Lakes, and in late October, 5 of us went to Dublin. We booked from a card in a window in the ferry terminal in Holyhead, which tells you exactly how organized we were. Somebody's aunt's friend's guest house, a Georgian terrace on the north side of the river. 4 floors and a basement kitchen, and it was one of those buildings that had been a fine house in about 1790 and had been coming down in the world ever since. Enormous ceilings, a staircase you could get 4 people abreast on, and cold in a way I have never experienced before or since. That damp coastal cold that gets into the plaster and never leaves. There were 5 of us that weekend. 3 took rooms on the 2nd floor, and Cindy and I got put in what the landlady called the front room. It had been the parlor. You could see it in about 4 seconds. The ceiling had a plaster medallion in the middle of it with nothing hanging from it, and there was a marble chimney piece too grand for the space. And the proportions were all wrong for sleeping. 2 iron beds had been put in a room built for a piano, and 40 years of Sunday afternoons. There was one enormous window onto the street, with shutters folded back into the reveals, and the door into the hall had a fan light over it that had been painted over. And there were fittings on the walls. That's the piece. 2 brass fittings, one either side of the chimney piece, at about shoulder height, with little curved arms and glass shades on them that didn't match each other. Gas lamps, converted. Obviously, somebody had run electric through them sometime, probably in the 20s, and there were bulbs in them, and a switch by the door, and they worked and I used them. I noticed them and thought they were lovely and did not think about it again. I was 21. Old buildings had old things in them. We got in late, 9:30, 10, after a day of walking. And I remember the room being so cold that Cindy and I both slept in our clothes with our coats over the eiderdowns. And I remember lying there listening to the building. It was full. There were people above us, and you could hear the floors. And there was a couple somewhere on the 2nd floor having a low argument in a language I couldn't place. And there was a clock on a landing. And I want to describe the smell because this is the whole thing. That house smelled like an old house. Damp coal, floor polish, and something else underneath. That Swedish chemical thing you get in old buildings that have had gas in them for 100 years. Anybody who has been in a Victorian building in Britain knows exactly what I'm talking about. It is not a leak. It's in the plaster. It's in the pipes that got capped off and left in the walls in 1935 and are still full of the ghost of what they carried. I've thought about that a great deal since. Now the dream. I've had probably 20,000 dreams since 1974, and I remember 6 of them. This one I can tell you moment by moment, and I could have on any day of the last 50 years. I was in the room, not a version of the room, exactly, with the shutters and the medallion and the 2 beds, and Cindy and hers, and me standing up in the middle of the floor between them. And it was dark, but the dark had a quality to it, a kind of thick blue. And the fittings on the wall were lit, not electric lit. There's a difference, and I knew it in the dream the way you know things in dreams. They were burning, a soft yellow that moved, and I could smell gas. Not the memory of gas, not the plaster smell, actual coal gas, that sharp headachy sulfur they put in it and the sweetness under it, and I remember the specific sensation of it in the back of my throat and behind my eyes. And I knew we had to get out. And I could not make myself work. That's the part. That is the entire content of the dream, and it is the thing that has stayed. I was trying to tell Cindy. I could see her in that bed, and I was trying to say her name and get her up. and everything I did happened at about a quarter speed. My mouth would not shape it. I got out, and I can still hear my own voice doing this. I got out the lights, and it took a very long time to say each word, arriving like something being lifted, and then they're leaking. They're leaking. That's what I said, in a room where the gas had been off since before I was born, and I could not get my arm up to point, and I could not get across 3 feet of floor to her bed. And the whole time the smell was getting worse, and the 2 lights on the wall were burning steady, and I understood. In that way, you understand things in dreams without being told, that we were already too far into it. That it had been going a long while before I woke up in there. Then I woke up, properly, on my back in a freezing room in Dublin and I looked because there was a street lamp outside and I had a watch. About 10 past 3. And the room smelled of gas. I want to be extremely careful here because I was 21 and I'd been walking all day and I'd had 2 pints, and this is exactly the sort of thing a person constructs. But I sat up in that bed and I put my feet on that floor and I could smell it, and I sat there for what was probably a minute and could not tell whether I was smelling it or remembering smelling it. Which is a distinction that gets very slippery at 3 in the morning. So I got up and I went and put my face right up against one of those fittings, old brass, cold, a bulb in it. And underneath the bulb, where the burner had been, there was a fitting with a little tap on it. The original gas cock, still there, painted over about 6 times. And I put my nose about an inch from it, and I could not smell anything at all except brass and old paint. I woke Cindy. She was furious with me in a whispered way, and she smelled nothing, and she told me to go back to bed. And I lay there until it got light, and then I got up and went and sat in the hall on the stairs because I could not be in that room anymore. Now here's the part that I've never known what to do with, and that is why I still tell this at 81. At breakfast, a basement kitchen, oilcloth on the table, a woman of about 60 doing eggs. I asked her. I asked it as a silly question, the way you'd ask about a picture on a wall, because I was mortified about the night and wanted to make it into a joke. I said, when did they take the gas out of the front room? And she stopped with the pan in her hand. And she said, which room did they put you in? I said, the front, on the ground. And she set that pan down and she wiped her hands and she said, and I've never lost the phrasing, there was a family in that room. And I said, and she said, long before us. And that was every single word she said about it. She would not answer another question. I asked her twice more and she talked about the eggs. And then she talked about the bus to Kilmainham. And then she went out of the kitchen and did not come back until we were leaving. That's all I got. I've had 51 years and that's all there's ever been. I went looking once, in the 80s, when a friend was doing genealogical work in Dublin and offered to have a look for me. She checked what could be checked. There is no newspaper account of a gas death at that address that she could find. And she was thorough. But she said something that stayed with me, which is that in a city with that many tenements, gas asphyxiation in the 20s and 30s was so common that it did not necessarily make the paper, that it was, in a great many cases, simply a way that poor people died in the winter. And it got a line in a coroner's book and nothing else. So there is nothing defined, and I have made my peace with that. Here's the reasonable version, and I've held it for most of my life. I was 21 and exhausted in a strange cold room in a foreign city, and I lay down under a plaster ceiling with 2 gas fittings on the wall and a 100-year-old smell in the plaster. And my brain, which had registered all of that consciously or not, built me a nightmare out of it. Sleep paralysis is well documented, and the slowed speech is one of its signatures. That explains every single element. It's what I'd tell you if you told me this, but that woman put a pan down, and what I turn over now, at 81, in a house in Fayette County with a hill behind it, isn't whether there was gas in that room. It's that in the dream I wasn't afraid for myself. I have gone back over it 10,000 times, and I have never once found any fear in it about me. The whole of it, the entire terrible slowed down effort of that dream was trying to get a word out to somebody in the next bed who was asleep and could not smell it. And I've never been able to decide whether that was my mind casting me in a story it had made up. Or whether, for about 4 minutes in the middle of an October night in 1974, I was somebody else, in the same room, having the worst night of her life over again, and the girl in the bed was not Cindy. Number of image prompts needed 70.